Chapter 13. The river narrowed as it wound between walls of alder and ash, its waters dark beneath the afternoon light. Scimitar let the current carry his small boat where the banks allowed, guiding it with slow strokes of his oar whenever roots or half-submerged stones reached for the hull. There was no path here any more. Whatever road had once followed the river had long since surrendered to moss and saplings. He had come this way because an old charcoal burner in the forest, eager to send him on his way, had spoken of roof lines glimpsed through the trees and orchards gone wild. The first sign was a rotting jetty, its pilings leaning drunkenly into the current. Someone had once cared enough to bind the split timbers with fresh-cut willow, though the lashings had weathered grey with years. Scimitar brought the boat alongside and stepped ashore. The village lay beyond a curtain of hazel. Perhaps 20 cottages stood around a broad green now claimed by waist-high grasses and foxgloves. Roofs had fallen inward beneath their own weight, leaving black mouths open to the sky. The village well remained capped, though ivy had climbed its stonework. An old byre had collapsed almost entirely, its beams softened with rot. Yet there were oddities. One cottage bore a roof patched with newer shingles than the rest. They had silvered with age, but not enough to belong with the older timbers. A garden wall had been rebuilt with careful hands, its stones neatly stacked despite the weeds pushing between them. Firewood sat beneath an overhang, split and piled properly, though the logs themselves had begun to crumble where rain had reached them. Not a family, Scimitar thought. 2 people, perhaps. No more. He found 2 crude stools outside the repaired cottage, one taller than the other. A cooking pot hung cold over a fire pit, whose stones had not entirely sunk into the earth. Whoever had lived here had tried to preserve something rather than build anew. Years ago, silence settled heavily across the green. He wandered without purpose until he came upon the shrine. It was little more than a waist-high stone beneath an ancient oak, its face carved with the worn likeness of the village's patron spirit. Scimitar stopped. He knew the crack that split the stone, knew the hollow beneath the western root, where children had hidden pebbles polished by the river. He crossed the clearing without feeling his feet touch the ground. The smithy stood where it should have been. Beside it, a cottage with 3 flat stepping stones leading to the door. 3, his breath caught. There had been 3 because his mother had tripped over the 4th while carrying water, and his father had laughed until she chased him across the yard with a wet cloth. He had never remembered that, not until now. The memory came all at once, not as fragments but whole. The smell of rye bread cooling on a windowsill, a dog with 1 white ear, the sound of his sister singing nonsense while weaving daisy chains. His father's hands, rough with soot, lifting him onto broad shoulders so he could reach the pear tree's lowest branches. Then smoke, not from hearths, screaming, strangers wearing boiled leather and iron caps, a hand closing around the back of his neck. His mother's voice disappearing behind him as he was dragged towards the river. He staggered against the old well, his hands trembling. This had been home. Here. He looked again at the careful repairs. Someone had come back. Not raiders, they would never have mended walls, and not travellers, they would not have bothered replacing roofs or stacking firewood. Someone who had loved this place. 2 someones. He knelt beside the cold hearth outside the repaired cottage. Beneath years of leaves lay the pale outline of old ashes, and within them, half buried, rested 2 carved wooden cups. One was larger than the other. Both had been worn smooth by long use. They had waited here together for a season, perhaps for many, waiting for people who never found their way home. Scimitar stood in the middle of the village street, surrounded by empty homes whose walls had weathered into the same dull grey as the river stones below. The silence no longer felt merely abandoned. It was familiar. This was where he had been born. Not simply a village like the one he barely remembered, but the village itself. The certainty settled without drama. A broken well, the bent oak at the edge of the square, the narrow lane that curved behind the old meeting hall. They matched fragments buried so deeply in his memory that he had always dismissed them as dreams. Someone had stolen him from this place before he had been old enough to understand what had been taken. There was nothing left to find here. Whatever answers the village had once held had long since blown away with the dust. A faint tremor reached him through the soles of his boots. He turned toward the river. Hooves. 5 horses emerged from the riverside track at an easy pace, weaving between alder trees before climbing toward the village. Scimitar dropped into a crouch behind the crumbling wall of a collapsed byre and watched. Not scouts, Queen's soldiers. The uniforms were travel-stained, but the cut was unmistakable. None wore the polished cuirasses or bright sashes of household cavalry. Plain mail shirts beneath faded surcoats, iron helmets with battered nasal guards, short cavalry spears slung carelessly, sabres at their hips. Line troopers, experienced enough to be dangerous, ordinary enough to be expendable. Their officer rode in front by perhaps 3 horse lengths, young, very young. His shoulders were too stiff, his reins held too tightly. Every few strides he corrected his mount for faults that existed only in his imagination. He bounced awkwardly in the saddle instead of moving with the horse, his eyes searching every doorway as though expecting an ambush with every breath. He was afraid of making the wrong decision. Behind him, the troopers made little effort to hide what they thought of him. One scratched idly beneath his helmet. Another yawned without bothering to cover his mouth. A third exchanged a glance with the rider beside him, accompanied by the faintest curl of a smile. Their formation drifted whenever the officer looked away, tightening only when he glanced back. Men who had survived enough campaigns to resent taking orders from someone who plainly had not. Bored, surly, contemptuous, useful. Scimitar studied the village instead of the men. The main street narrowed sharply between 2 cottages whose upper floors leaned toward one another. Horses would have to slow there. Beyond it, loose rubble from a collapsed chimney littered the track. Farther uphill, the ground steepened where rain had carved gullies across the lane, breaking any chance of a proper charge. 5 mounted men became 5 men arriving one after another, better. His bow could account for one before they knew where he lay. The officer, most likely. Confusion was worth more than rank. If they dismounted to search, the alleys and broken walls would deny them room to surround him. If they stayed mounted, their own horses would hinder them in the cramped streets. He slipped silently between 2 ruined cottages until he reached a roofless smithy overlooking the narrowest part of the lane. Thick stone walls concealed him, while offering clear lines of fire through the empty doorway. He nocked an arrow and slowed his breathing. Perhaps they would ride through, perhaps they would leave. But if they chose to search the village, they would discover that abandoned places sometimes had defenders after all. The horses entered the village at a walk. The officer raised one hand. "Spread out." The command lacked conviction. His men obeyed slowly, more from habit than respect. 2 riders drifted toward the cottages on the eastern side of the street. Another paused near the well, peering down into its black throat. The remaining pair lingered behind the officer, sabres still sheathed. Scimitar did not move. He watched them breathe, watched the weight of each horse settle through its forelegs, watched where every eye wandered. The moment arrived and his bowstring whispered. The arrow struck the officer's shoulder instead of his throat. Iron links burst apart with a sharp crack as the bodkin punched through mail, driving him sideways from the saddle. He hit the ground with a cry, clutching the wound. Alive. Scimitar was already moving. The soldiers shouted, "Ambush!" There! Another arrow flashed from the smithy before the first had finished ringing against stone. It buried itself deep in the neck of the nearest horse. The animal screamed. It reared violently, throwing its rider into the rubble with enough force to knock the breath from him. The horse crashed across the narrow lane, thrashing in blind panic, blocking the passage exactly as Scimitar had intended. Not the man, the horse, always the horse. He hated that calculation almost as much. The remaining riders spurred forward, trying to force their mounts through the bottleneck. Too late. Scimitar dropped the bow. By the time the first saber cleared its scabbard, he was already among them. His sword came free with effortless precision. The first cut severed a spear shaft rather than flesh. The broken weapon spun from the soldier's grasp. Scimitar pivoted beneath the frightened horse's neck, struck the rider's wrist with the pommel, and sent the saber tumbling into the dirt. A kick to the chest hurled the man from his saddle. Alive. Another rider bore down on him. Steel hissed. Scimitar stepped inside the slash. His body remembered before his mind could object. His blade thrust beneath the arm where mail opened to permit movement. He felt ribs. He felt resistance, felt the point slide between them. The soldier's eyes widened. For an instant they simply stared at one another. Then the man folded silently over the saddle and fell. Scimitar froze. No. He had aimed to disable. He knew he had. But the movement drilled into him since childhood had corrected itself in the final heartbeat, finding the gap no conscious swordsman could have exploited. Perfect. Fatal. The dead man's blood ran along the edge of the blade. Scimitar's stomach tightened. Another attack came. Training seized control once more. He ducked beneath a spear thrust, caught the shaft under his arm, and twisted. Wood snapped. The rider stumbled forward. Scimitar struck with the flat of his sword across the helmet. The soldier toppled unconscious into the mud. Better. Behind him someone shouted, "He's only one man!" That is no man. The oldest trooper dismounted instead of charging. Smarter. He drew his saber with the relaxed confidence of a veteran and circled through the ruins, forcing Scimitar away from the fallen horses. At last. Someone who knew what he was doing. They met without words. Steel rang. The veteran attacked with measured economy, each cut designed to herd rather than kill. He had recognized what the others had not, that speed alone would not overcome this opponent. Scimitar answered instinctively. Parry, turn, riposte. Their blades became pale arcs in the narrow street. The veteran frowned. At the scars, at the tattoos, at the teeth. Recognition too late. Scimitar's conditioning saw the opening. His sword slipped beneath the veteran's defense like flowing water. He tried to turn the edge aside. Tried. His wrist refused. The point entered low beneath the breastbone. The old soldier gasped. Scimitar caught him before he struck the ground. "I'm sorry." The words escaped before he realized he had spoken them. The veteran looked at him with fading eyes. Then he died. Silence crashed over the street. Only 2 soldiers remained capable of fighting. One knelt beside the wounded officer, dragging him toward cover. The other stood motionless, staring at the 3 fallen comrades scattered across the village road. He had seen enough. He hauled the officer onto a riderless horse. Neither man looked back as they galloped down the lane, leaving the dead, the unconscious, and the wounded horse behind. Scimitar made no attempt to pursue. He stood alone in the middle of the empty village. His breathing was steady, his pulse scarcely elevated. His body had performed exactly as it had been taught. Around him lay the proof. He knelt beside the veteran whose eyes were already growing dull. A stranger, someone who had laughed around campfires, someone who might have had children waiting for him in some distant town, someone whose name Scimitar would never know. I didn't want this. The words vanished into the deserted streets. His sword remained in his hand. He looked at it for a long time before wiping the blade with slow, deliberate care. Not because it deserved respect, because he could not bear to look at the blood.